Okay, so hi everyone, my name's Laura Taylor and I'm Policy Analyst in the Strategy team at Homes England, and I'm here today supporting Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre. I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's Summer Learning Programme. This offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics that you told us are of interest to you. Today's event is on the subject of building sustainable homes and places. So this summer learning programme is brought to you by Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre. This slide summarises who we are and what we do. We've launched the centre following extensive research and consultation with you across local government and with a whole range of other partners to determine where authorities most need support and how this can be best delivered. Next slide, please. On the screen, you'll now be able to see a breakdown of the session today. Before I run through the agenda, it's important to emphasise why we're here today to discuss building sustainable homes and places. Climate change is something that will affect each and every one of us during our lifetime. To support the government's ambitions for sustainability, there is increasing recognition from the housing industry that there is a role for us to play, which is made evident by the number of people on the call today. Tackling climate change is new for us all, and there is not a clear path as to how the housing industry can support the government to achieve net zero. So this session has therefore been designed specifically to provide an overarching view and awareness of building sustainable homes and places and share examples of what can be achieved. We'll begin with Ben Ward, who is our Senior Strategy Manager at Homes England, and he'll be providing an overview of the policy context around sustainable homes and places. Following this, we'll have two case studies. We're delighted to have Jim Gillan from Gateshead Council here with us today to share details of the Gateshead District Energy Scheme. And we're also thrilled to have Andrew Turnbull from Norwich City Council here with us today to share details of the Goldsmith Street Scheme. Both are excellent examples of what can be achieved when we wanted to build more sustainable homes and places. Amir Poole, Homes England's Technical Manager for Sustainability, will then provide an overview of the Future Home Standard. And finally, we were due to have Seiju Desai here with us today, our Head of Technical Excellence and Sustainability, but unfortunately Seiju's unwell, so Sarah Greenwood, our Assistant Director of Sustainability and Design, has kindly agreed to step in and will be concluding the presentation and giving her key takeaway points. We'll be finishing with a Q&A, and then I'll be drawing the session to a close with a further poll to get some immediate feedback on the session. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ben.
Thank you, Laura, and welcome everyone to today's session. If we can move to the next slide, please. So I'm Ben Ward. I'm the Senior Strategy Manager within the strategy team at Homes England. I'm going to talk a bit about the kind of policy context around sustainability and sustainable homes. So sustainable homes and places, it's a very broad topic. It can cover a vast array of issues and specialisms, and I'm sure we've got people on the call today with interests in many different aspects of that. So my job is to help frame and ground this session by setting out some of the key policy and regulatory context and what it means for the built environment, for housing delivery, and for Homes England as an agency. First, I think it's important to say a bit about kind of Homes England and who we are, how we relate to government. We're an executive non-departmental public body sponsored by the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, and that means that we deliver housing programmes on behalf of the government and in support of government policy objectives. So in reality, that means working with and through our partners across relevant sectors to deliver homes and places, and as such our relationships with local, combined and mayoral authorities are absolutely critical. The Housing and Regeneration Act 2008 gave us an important statutory role in supporting partners and wider industry to produce well-designed and sustainable homes. So sustainability, sustainable development, quality, good design, they're all deeply ingrained in what we do as an agency. When Homes England was formed in 2018, the agency and its strategy were designed and focused to support the key policy challenges set out in the 2017 Housing White Paper. So essentially, our focus was about increasing supply, affordability and home ownership and shaping markets that could deliver on those objectives. What we see more recently is a gradual shift towards a wider focus for government policy relating to housing and the built environment. The market challenges haven't gone away. But several kind of interlinked and sometimes competing, it has to be said, policy agendas have risen up alongside them. So notably the Levelling Up agenda recently quality, beauty, and planning reform in relation to those issues, net zero and decarbonisation, and environmental protection and enhancement. So for us, the response to those agendas has to be integrated. It's impossible to split out the desire to build better quality homes and places from the need to build homes and places that minimise emissions, homes and places that promote biodiversity, and homes and places that are resilient to climate change. These are all the same homes and places, so we need to tackle these challenges in an integrated way. So next slide, please. So on net zero and decarbonising homes and places, in 2019, the UK became the first major economy to legislate to set a binding target of net zero emissions by 2050. The built environment sector is a major contributor to overall UK emissions, and that's both direct emissions that are associated with buildings and their operations, and indirect emissions such as those from transport. Existing homes and buildings account for the bulk of these, and new homes, we know, are much more energy efficient on average than existing stock. But we also know that tackling emissions from new homes now will be important to meeting net zero by 2050. And not doing so would mean storing up problems for the future. So last year, partly kind of accelerated and boosted by the UK's role in hosting COP26, government published its net zero strategy and its heat and building strategy, which are the key policy documents that set out the government's approach in this area. For new homes, regulation in the form of the Future Homes Standard and Part L uplift are the main policy levers for decarbonising new homes in use. The new building regs that have been in place since June aim to reduce emissions by 31%, and Future Home Standard will reduce emissions by 75 to 80%, with the future decarbonisation of the energy grid upping this towards net zero. I'm not going to steal Amir's thunder too much here, as he'll be talking through the technical implications in more detail later in the session. And we'll also be hearing about two excellent examples of how to tackle in-use emissions in practice from Jim and Andrew shortly. It's important to say for us, though, that success in the longer term will also mean considering the carbon impact of homes and places across their whole life. And that means taking more of a cradle to grave view of the carbon impact of homes, but also thinking about the implications of spatial design at the place level on transport emissions, for example. Next slide, please. So moving on to the policy agenda around the wider environmental sustainability of homes and places. The 25-year environment plan, which was published in 2018, set out the government's broad ambitions to protect and enhance the natural environment for the long term. And since then, the Environment Act has received royal assent in November and will provide a mechanism to set clear statutory targets for nature recovery in 4 priority areas, so in air quality, biodiversity, water and waste. It also sets a target to reverse the decline in species abundance by the end of 2030, and that's supported by local nature recovery strategies, and a national nature recovery network, a strengthened duty to enhance and report on biodiversity, and alongside that, a regulated mechanism for trading biodiversity credits. Importantly, local planning authorities are already leading the way in adopting planning related provisions, particularly on biodiversity, into local policies ahead of national requirements passing into law. And for us, considering the biodiversity, the climate resilience and the wider environmental impacts of the homes and places that we create is an absolutely critical aspect of delivering sustainable homes and places alongside the kind of carbon impacts. Next slide, please. So to summarise and to talk a bit about how Homes England is responding to that agenda, the Levelling Up White Paper begins to set out an enhanced role for the agency in the regeneration of places alongside enabling new homes. And at the heart of the Levelling Up agenda is an objective to drive social justice and social equity and create opportunities for people and create places that people are proud of. And that aligns really well with a kind of broad view of sustainability that encompasses social and economic outcomes alongside environmental outcomes. And as I said earlier, the most successful homes and places will consider and respond to all of those areas in a balanced and integrated way. We're in a process of refreshing our strategic plan at the moment to reflect a renewed emphasis on placemaking, design quality, sustainability. And we're looking forward to publishing the strategic plan later this year, and it will set out how we can support local places in their ambitions through our funding, our expertise, our influence, our convening power, and in the sort of policy context that I've just set out. It's important to acknowledge that Homes England doesn't have all the answers, or indeed all of the levers, and we know that along with the sector at large, we need to go further. So we want to work with and support our partners in the wider sector over the longer term to deliver on shared ambitions around sustainable homes and places. So learning from the best and using platforms like today to share good practice will be key to that. So thanks everyone for joining today's session. I know we're all really looking forward to hearing from Jim and Andrew on their experience of delivering in practice. Before we do that, we wanted to encourage some audience participation and understand a bit more about where you are on sustainability in your local areas. So we're going to do that through a few poll questions, which I'll run through now, and hopefully we'll get some live results that we can kind of feed back to you. So the first of those questions is on the screen now. What does sustainability mean to you and your local authority? And I'll give people a bit of time to think about and submit a response. We should start to see a word cloud appearing on the screen, which we can then reflect on. Some people very quick off the mark. So I'm seeing net zero, climate emergency, green energy. There's some broader themes around kind of future-proofing homes and I guess climate resilience. Some of those themes are around kind of quality and location of development, which is obviously kind of important. Okay, yeah. So I think I think I've mentioned most of the main themes that have come out there. That's really interesting. Thanks for your responses. I think we'll move on to the next poll. So the next question should be on your screen now. It's does your authority have a clear sustainability strategy or plan, and do you understand what your role is? So again, we should start to see some results, and they are quite reassuring, I think, on the whole. So 56% I'm seeing have at the moment have a clear sustainability strategy and plan, and people understand their roles. We've got about 30% that is either no or do not know, and a smaller number, so 15%, that where people have a plan or are aware of a plan but don't necessarily understand their role. So that's interesting. But yeah, and those numbers seem to have settled down a little bit. We've got 225 responses, so that's that I can see. So that's good, and I think broadly reassuring. But it'd be interesting to see how that moves over the next few years. I think we'll move on then to the third poll question, which is what are the main barriers to delivering sustainable homes and places for your local area? And again, we should see a word cloud here starting to appear. Very clear theme in the first few things to emerge there. So cost, viability, finance, land availability. I can also see there affordability. So lots around kind of the cost and viability side. Skill shortage also appearing. I think that's one of the big challenges, is how kind of supply chains respond to kind of changing regulations. Developer reluctance, I can see there. Okay, that's starting to settle down. We've got 220 something responses, so that's really good. And thank you for giving us your thoughts. That's really helpful. And I think with that, we will kind of move on to Jim. I'll hand over.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me to speak about our scheme in Gateshead. Next slide, please. So basically, I head up a small energy services team in Gateshead for the last 12 years or so. And I think what started out as a team looking at reducing cost and carbon for the council, I guess it grew into basically a service that's starting to deliver major energy generation assets for the borough, for heat and for power, largely born out of some of the challenges we've had in actually trying to enforce some of the greener building standards in new commercial and housing developments in the northeast. Particularly because of, we have other challenges in the northeast in terms of sort of like development sites and land prices, which make it harder for developments to go green. So effectively, we took the initiative and started investing in large-scale infrastructure to provide some of that opportunities for developers so that they can connect to green infrastructure, hopefully at a cheaper cost and without a premium, so we can deliver those higher sustainability standards now. And currently, we run a number of assets that supply heat and power to over 700 customers, be that schools, public buildings, commercial sites, and also domestic customers. Next slide, please. We used to concentrate on decarbonising heat and power. I think our focus now is largely on heat, and that's largely because the graph in front of you shows that we now think we are on a trajectory that UK grid carbon should be close to zero carbon by maybe the middle of the next decade. It's completely opposite with gas and heat. And if we did nothing, we'd be waiting until 2040, 2050 for similar decarbonisation. And as a borough with a zero carbon target for our assets by 2030, we've shifted focus onto zero carbon heat. Next slide, please. I mean, clearly there's many ways that we can decarbonise heat. I guess we're fortunate in Gateshead that we're working with Northern Gas Networks. And this basically is an infographic of their development site at Low Thornley, which currently has the UK's first 100% hydrogen home, testing new appliances and a test bed for industry. It also significantly is the first UK trial of a public blended gas network where 20% hydrogen has been going into 650 homes in the village of Winlayton over the last year or so. And that's really helping Northern Gas Networks agree and set the new framework and regulations for the industry and the HSEs to allow blended hydrogen to go into the network across the UK. However, we accept that this really is the long game. We know that there needs to be hydrogen generation infrastructure coming, and we don't expect to see massive impacts on this sort of like before 2030. So it still leaves us with a challenge that we've got between now and then. I should say, I'm sure the audience will be very familiar with individual heat pumps. And I think our view at the moment is there's great application for those, particularly in new build. However, we remain concerned about their suitability and retrofit, both from a technical sense and also in a cost perspective, particularly with the current cost of living crisis and energy. We're loath to support anything that's going to potentially put customers' fuel bills up further than they are. So that leaves us with heat networks. If I can have the next slide, please. And really, in the last kind of like 5 to 10 years, we've been really exploring how we can deliver and develop heat networks to deliver our objectives of providing lower cost and lower carbon heat to customers. And we're finding that these remain the most viable option for us this decade. Yes, there's high capital costs for these, but we find there is a lot of grant support for those. And importantly, these can operate on a long-term business model and that use the revenues from selling that heat to recover all of those capital investments in the early years. And most importantly, we feel this can be done by keeping heat tariffs at or below the current gas market. So at the moment, we feel this is one of the only technologies to deliver that low carbon solution without putting a premium on people's heating bills. Next slide, please. So we've been operating our main heat network in Gateshead Town Centre since 2018, and this building in front of you is Gateshead Energy Centre. It was initially built using natural gas as its main source for combined heat and power, and at that time it was better than the grid for both heat and power. As the grid's improved, we are now on a par and will shortly be worse than the grid if we don't do anything about it, which is why we started decarbonising our current heat networks. Next slide, please. So that involves looking around our borough about what resources we have. And this is a map of Gateshead Town Centre in front of you, bordered by the River Tyne to the north. And we did start looking at the river as a source of renewable heat. There's plenty of heat flowing down that. However, in winter, the river temperatures get down to about 6 or 7 degrees. And so you can't take a lot of that out before freezing that water. or you have to use a lot of volume of water to get the heat you need out of it. And so that's where we started discussions with the Coal Authority, who really opened our eyes to the amazing assets beneath our feet in the town centre of Gateshead. So what you're looking at here, all these hatched lines, that's effectively a mine network that's 150 metres below our feet there, that we've drilled into to access that mine. And there were about 6 different levels of mine workings we could have gone into, and this was the deepest, most accessible we could find. Next slide, please. So it's not that straightforward. We have to do a lot of civil engineering, and we've been drilling for the last 18 months to find the right locations to access the mines and also return water to the mines once we've taken the heat out. And just to give you a scale, that picture on the right there, that's a 16-inch steel case, and that's a 25-metre section. So we needed 6 of those to go down 150 metres, and we've done that twice for 2 boreholes to get to the mine workings we need. Next slide, please. To put this in context of where we are, this is now our regeneration plan for Gateshead Town Centre. Effectively, we've got the Gateshead Quays development to the north and existing sites like the Sage and the Baltic, and also we've got a main regeneration area called Baltic Quarter, where we've got some office development as well. And as I said earlier, while we started off doing these schemes to reduce cost and carbon for the council and customers, it's now become central to our regeneration strategy for the borough, and particularly the town centre. Having those assets like we have now, the energy centre to the bottom there, and you can see connected up by a purple pipe, that's going to our new mine water heat pump system, which is extracting the heat from the mines. And also we've managed to get funding from another public sector scheme, the decarbonisation scheme, to fund a major urban solar park, providing renewable power into our heat pump and also our wider private wire network. And we are now finding that this green infrastructure is so important to unlocking the regeneration to help developers come to and develop green buildings without having the premium cost of investing in plant themselves. And that applies whether it's an arena, or a conference centre, a building, or a new housing site as well. Next slide, please. So this is what a mine water borehole looks like on the surface. Basically, at the end of that blue pipe, there's a 150-metre deep hole that's going into the mine workings, and we pull out that mine water about 15 degrees, take it down to about 7 degrees, and send that back to another set of mine workings. And then what we do, next slide please, is we take that mine water and we put it into a heat pump building. So what you're looking at here, this is probably now the UK's largest mine water heat pump system operating. We can say it's operating because we turned it on for the first time 2 weeks ago, and we had our formal launch of this yesterday, attended by contractors and the Coal Authority. And it's doing what it said. It takes that water out, chills the mine water, and heats up our water that can go into our network. This asset now can run for 20 years plus, and importantly, we think it's going to produce about probably 40 to 50% of the heat on our network going forward. Next slide, please. So decarbonising is one challenge we have, and we're not all the way yet. We're probably halfway there, and we continue to look at other sources like hydrogen, deep geothermal that will take us to being zero carbon by 2030. But the other challenge is once you have a renewable source of heat is getting it to where you need to go. And so this is where you're looking at now our network master plan for the heat network in the centre of Gateshead. So the green network is what's been operating since 2018, and there's a bit further on there that's not shown. Also, the blue network is a recent expansion we've done to other council sites. And importantly, that now starts taking us past some housing sites. So if I can have the next button, please. I think it's fair to say we've succeeded in connecting to some sites. So this in front of you is Riga, one of our new commercial offices, 5,000 square metres, which was our first commercial site we connected to for heat and power. Next and next again. Also importantly, new development sites like the Sage Arena and Conference Centre. This site is due to be constructed in a couple of years, and again is in partnership with the council and developers. And because we have this infrastructure in place now, we have binding agreements where that site will take heat and power from our network to ensure it's a green building. Next, please. The existing network does also have social housing. We have about 350 high-rise social housing units on the network, and so our customers are receiving that low-cost, low-carbon heat as well. Next, again, please. And next slide, I think. So what our challenge is now is that we've demonstrated the viability of heat networks in the urban core, where heat loads are dense. We have a good mix of loads. What we're trying to do now is getting out to our external housing sites, both new build developments and existing ones. If I can have the next slide, please. Some of the challenge for those is the densities start to go down, and that's what we have to challenge. So we already have tested our domestic offering in some of our high-rise settings, which are elsewhere in the borough. So these are part of 6 blocks of about 500 customers, which are on heat networks currently. Next slide, please. So it's important for us to test some of the technologies and some of the servicing infrastructure first. So you can see here, this is where we have 2 blocks connected in a small heat network with a sheltered housing unit on the left. And importantly, that grey box at the bottom is our plant room, which houses a ground source heat pump. And this picture was taken during construction, and a lot of the brown earth you can see is where we were basically drilling a network of 100 boreholes that allow us to run this as a ground source heat pump system. Next slide, please. So as well as making the technology work in the plant room, we need to make it effective for customers. So all customers receive a heat interface unit no bigger than a combi boiler. So effectively, that is interaction free with the customer. They simply control the heating through a thermostat and a timer like they would a combi boiler. So again, it makes it very easy to use for customers. Next slide, please. And the other thing we need to get in place is our metering and billing infrastructure. So we work with third parties so that customers get a very slick, easy to use platform that allows them to do smart prepayment to settle their issues on the bills. And also it provides response and maintenance for any issues they have day to day as they need it. Next slide, please. So with the technological learning we've had and working on the commercial and servicing side, we're now in a position to take heat networks into new build housing developments. So this site in front of you is called the Freight Depot site. It's 271 units, and importantly, it's been delivered by partnership by the council, Vistry, and something called Gateshead Regeneration Partnership, which is taking that forward as a development. We've come along on side of that and basically offered them a heat connection. So what you're looking at there is the red and the blue lines are effectively the heat network that will be taken into that site, so it can be built without a gas connection, and all customers get a heat interface unit and get delivered that lower cost, lower carbon heat, partly from the mine water, at no premium to the developer. And ongoing as well, it's important that the customers will get that heat supplied to them at or below the market rate compared to gas. And so that's the way we're trying to make it affordable and deliverable for these types of development. We are to be starting on taking our network to the edge of that site next month, and work will start early in next year for a heat on date, probably the middle of next year. Next slide, please. Our next challenge is trying to get networks into low-rise housing estates, and we're finding that when we do, we've got about 10 to 15,000 homes in these kind of estates, and they're also co-located with schools, care homes, etc. So we can decarbonise a lot of our estate by getting heat networks into these. So we have a £3 million grant to try this one, hopefully in a year's time, to prove that as well. Next slide, please. We want to take it bigger, so we have started looking at feasibility at the community scale. This is an area that's got 3,000 homes and a lot of public buildings and commercials. This might come with, say, a £50 to £60 million price tag, but it's the kind of scheme we're looking at to really take it wider into our communities. So next slide, last slide as well. So our goal is we have a number of assets already in the borough. Next, please. We're trying to add to that with some pilot schemes. Next slide, please. But effectively what we're looking to do is see how we can bring this together into a portfolio of sites that we can take to the market to really deliver probably 5 heat networks in the next 5 to 10 years, with the goal of getting over 10,000 homes onto heat networks. We realise that won't deliver zero carbon to the whole of the borough, but that's where we're relying on other technologies like heat pumps in new homes, and also the evolution of hydrogen to really take the whole community on its zero carbon journey. So thank you very much. I appreciate it's been a whistle-stop tour, and I'm happy now to hand over to Andrew Turnbull from Norwich City Council to hear more about their scheme at Goldsmith Street. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Very interesting. Also, my thanks to the Capacity Centre for inviting me to talk to you today. If I could have the next slide, please. And the next one, sorry. So just a little bit of scene setting around Norwich City Council before going into the Goldsmith Street scheme. Council has set us strong ambitions around meeting the housing need in the district, which is around 200 affordable homes a year. But they're also very keen that we stick to social rents and not affordable rents, so that they are addressing kind of all aspects of poverty for our tenants. In Norwich, we have around about 12% of residents that are currently in fuel poverty. And so they started to set us the target of looking at building standards that would help address that. But they were also keen that it wasn't just about building homes, it was about creating communities. And so we started to think about the sustainability overall and not just about the specific properties that people live in, but the communities, the landscaping, the biodiversity, and all of those aspects around sustainability. That took real leadership and kind of required different thinking. We were very lucky in Norwich that we had a couple of local registered providers that had already started to kind of go down this journey that were really helpful with supporting us on this. And I have to say a big thank you to Broadland Housing and Hastow Housing for kind of leading the way and kind of sharing their learning with us. We're also keen that we spread the message, though, and the part of my being here today is about hopefully inspiring other local authorities to kind of do this. It's not rocket science. If I could have the next slide, please. So there are numerous benefits for delivering passive house homes, which Goldsmith Street was. The Passive House Trust very helpfully provide this slide. But for me, there's kind of a couple of few key areas. One is we have declared a climate emergency in Norwich, as have most local authorities now. We do need to start addressing that. Taking a low carbon approach to new build is kind of one way we can do this. For me as a kind of development manager, it was around concerns of the building performance gap in new homes. And Passive House really does do what it says on the tin. And by testing it throughout construction, you know that what you get at the end is what was designed. And then kind of other issues that are starting to show themselves is around health and well-being. So, anecdotal reports of reduced asthma, eczema, and hay fever in the people who live in passive house homes. So it's really about that kind of social benefits to residents, as well as the lower fuel bills that they would achieve. If I could have next slide, please. So helpfully, our design team laid out to me in simple terms of what is passive house. And there's kind of 6 key elements to this. So the first one is that it's a very airtight building. Standard building regs homes have 5 air changes an hour. In a passive house home, that's 0.6 air changes an hour. So therefore, it's much more airtight, about 10 times more airtight than a standard home. To do that, you have kind of membranes, but also high levels of insulation. So on the Goldsmith Street scheme, we've got 450 mil of insulation in the walls, floors, ceilings. So super insulated homes. We also want to tap into that free heat that you get from the sun. And so kind of orientation is a key point, which is the building form in the bottom. But what we have is trying to maximize that solar gain at the height of the winter. So kind of really getting that light coming into the ground floor windows was a key aspect of the scheme, but also making sure that we're not producing overheating in the summer. So we've used brise-soleils and offsetting windows to achieve that. I think with the new Part O regs around overheating, that's something that we weren't mindful of. And I'm keen to kind of look at that in more detail going forward. But the key piece of kit that you have in a passive house home is the mechanical ventilation heat recovery system, MVHR as it's known. And what we were told by our design team is that if we're looking at savings anywhere in the scheme, don't make it in your MVHR, go for the best one that you can afford. This is the key piece of kit that keeps the thermal comfort regular throughout the home. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't have that kind of breaking down and causing problems for our tenants. The building form is key. So we have got east-west terraces that are north-south facing, so really maximising that sun. Terrace homes really do lend itself very well to this. If I could have next slide, please. So one of the kind of key reasons that we started to look at passive house was around that fuel poverty for residents. And this slide is a little bit old now, so with the recent uplifts in fuel bills, the cost would be a little bit more than this. But what we were seeing is that to space heat a 2-bedroom house, we were looking at only about £150 for our residents, compared to sort of 800-900 that they were seeing in the standard building regs. It also shows that we don't have particularly far to go from doing passive house to try and get that down to a zero carbon home. And so what we're kind of like looking at now is the passive house principles plus renewables to try and take our standards down to that zero carbon. So we've done 3 schemes for passive house in Norwich. So these are the other 2 that we've done. So the scheme at the top left was a small scheme of 10 units. It was our first scheme. Took a few learning points from that scheme, particularly around what we need to tell our residents, because the first thing that one of the residents did was to screw a blind into the window frame. So we've also kind of learned that we ideally need to do 2 filter changes a year ourselves, just to keep that MVHR running as efficiently as it can. And then the scheme at the bottom was actually a scheme being delivered by our wholly owned company. That's 153 homes, 2/3 of which are private and 1/3 of which we took back into the council. And about 112 of the 153 we were able to deliver as passive house at relatively low uplift on a standard building regs. The other 40 odd would have been too expensive for us to deliver that. As they were selling for privately, we felt that we would just kind of do those to building regs, but to a higher spec of building regs by having the triple glaze and still putting some of the elements in, like the mechanical vent heat recovery. If I can have next slide, please. So Goldsmith Street was delivered. Originally, we weren't working to deliver it ourselves. We were working in partnership with 3 local registered providers. We set out with them that we would run an RIBA competition to select the architects, to get some different thinking into the city, to look at what was out there, to see how we could do. We wanted this to be a really exemplar scheme. It was the largest kind of regeneration scheme we'd done at that time. And our design and conservation officers wrote the design brief with real ambition to triple the density, but to keep a mix of houses and flats, to have reduced parking. It's only a 10-minute walk away from the city centre, and to kind of improve the transport design so that we get better pedestrian and cycle links. We also decided that we would deliver the scheme through a JCT standard contract, which really isn't the norm these days. Design and build has become king. And I think for me, that was really key to keeping the ethos of the scheme and keeping the high level of standards that we delivered. Next slide, please. So Goldsmith Street. So this is the location plan. The dark blob to the bottom right is the castle in Norwich, if anyone knows it. So you can see it's very close to the city centre. We got planning permission for 105 new homes. We had to split it into 2 phases just because we had a couple of rights of way with a local business that we needed to resolve, and that wouldn't have been resolved in time with the contract. But you can see that we've delivered a real mix of houses and flats, so roughly 50-50. And that was delivered through those terraces that were kind of shown. The dark terracing to the bottom left of the plan is actually the most popular kind of housing in the city. It's in an area known as the Golden Triangle. And there was a couple of key design features that we took from that into the scheme. If I can have next slide, please. So what you can see is the scheme on the left was that 2009 RIBA competition. The scheme on the right is actually what's been delivered. Very, very similar to what was originally intended, but we've put a bit more green in and taken a couple of housing blocks out. But the terrace streets are mirroring those of the Golden Triangle. They are 14 metres front to front, 14 metres back to back. And if there are any planners in the room, then that was a challenge for us, because we know that you like to see 18 to 22 metres. But what we were able to kind of demonstrate is that we wanted this to be a home zone to reduce traffic flow, and that would really help us with that. And planners were won over by the design team. I'm not saying that that's going to be easy in every local authority, but certainly getting planners on board early helped us with this. Next slide, please. So this is just the kind of overlay to show you those terraces, showing the east-west terracing and the north-south facing terraces. Next slide, please. The form, so what we were advised is terraces are really, really good for passive house because you've only got 2 elevations open to the elements. So you get a lot of kind of free heat from your neighbours, which is great. We were told kind of with a review after the fact that if we'd made them slightly longer and thinner, we could have saved even more energy and made them even more efficient for our tenants. And I'm keen that we learn from every project that we do and kind of take those learnings forward for future projects. Next slide, please. So this is it, the scheming section. What you can see is that we really wanted to maximise that winter sun by going with a 15-degree pitched roof. Did create a few issues with materials. Originally we had a zinc roof, but when budget came in over what we needed, we switched that to a double interlocking pantile that could deliver that, so that we kept that 15-degree pitch. So even though we're only 14 metres between properties, those bottom ground floor properties do achieve that winter sun. And then we've got the solar shading as previously discussed. Next slide, please. So these are just the images of those properties on site. The flat blocks, what we wanted is that everyone had their own entrance at ground floor level. So we have no communal areas in the flats on the site. So really inventive with kind of a wraparound staircase to get to the 3rd floor on that one. That was kind of one of the key things we wanted to reduce issues of antisocial behaviour and people storing things in corridors for health and safety risk. And then the picture on the right is the 2 and 4 bedroom houses that are typical on the site. 2 beds are 20% above national described space standards, but 90 square metres. And the 4 beds were created by making them 1 metre wider than the 2 beds, creating a dormer on the top floor to get the extra bedroom. The 2 bedrooms have a very large landing area, which during COVID has been, wonderful for our residents. They've used it for kind of storage, home office working and children's play. So it was semi-off-site, so Signum timber frame system, slotted together on site, and then warm cell insulation blown into the cavity. We went with warm cell just as a sustainability factor because we didn't want the plastic eco bead. So we even though we weren't setting out to be a zero carbon, we had those kind of materials in mind as we were during the design phase. What we've seen from doing kind of retrospective looking at Goldsmith Street is our CO2 emissions were actually very low compared to standard building regs. I say we didn't set it out to be a zero carbon, but it really showed us that the decisions we took would take us on that journey. Next slide, please. And we then retrospectively looked at it and compared it to the REBA 2030 climate challenge targets. And this was key for me. So operational energy, we're already hitting that. As I said earlier, we could have even achieved better than that with a slightly narrower form. So we're well on the way with the operational energy. The one that surprised me was embodied carbon. As I said, we didn't set out for that, but the materials we selected with timber frame, with the warm cell insulation, showed that actually we were already making those right decisions to get down on that. And water use, we just went for a code 4, but slightly bettered it. But we will be starting to look at that in more detail around sustainability going forward. Next slide, please. So just around sustainability, I think key for me is landscaping as well, and just creating those areas for wildflowers, for biodiversity, but also for community and children playing. So if you can show the next slide. So these are just some of the kind of landscape features on site. The top right is the key one for me, which is the semi-private spaces between terraces that allow children to just play naturally. And we're seeing that that's actually getting people out of their bedrooms. They're running around, they're playing basketball, they're riding on scooters, which is lovely to see for me. Next slide, please. So everyone is always interested in building costs. So we think Passive House was typically 5 to 10% above our standard build cost at the time. These are 2016 figures. So I do need to caveat that, and we know that the construction industry has seen massive rises in inflation in costs. We're able to fund this because we do have significant housing stock that we can use borrowing against our properties, and we also retain our right to buy receipts that we were able to put into this scheme. Next slide, please. So just a few lessons learned. So that building form and orientation are key for me in terms of achieving Passive House at a reasonable cost. the landscape can really help you with that community building aspect, but also with biodiversity. Collaboration is key in Passive House. Having all of your contractors, subcontractors, design team collaborating together and being on board was really key to achieving the standards that we set. We're also lucky in Norwich, because of that work previously by the housing associations, that we've got contractors who have delivered Passive House, and so therefore the pricing in of the risk isn't as great. There is still an element of that, but it's perhaps not quite as big as it would be in other areas. Doing the standard contract, as I mentioned earlier. The education to our tenants is key. So we've learned from that initial scheme that we need to tell our tenants a little bit more, but we also ran training sessions for our maintenance colleagues and for our contractors, run by the Green Building Store on some of the kit that we'd use, like the MVHR unit. And that's kind of key to just kind of embedding that within our maintenance programs. Utilities, I don't want to touch that too much, but we won't be using gas going forward because of future homes, but gas did cause a number of issues for us on this site in terms of delays. And then post-occupancy evaluation, I'm very keen on. We weren't able to do this on Goldsmith Street, primarily because of COVID and other priorities coming in, but we are now starting that work. So last week we've sent out surveys to all of our residents, and we're speaking to a university about some specific post-occupancy evaluation on overheating, just to kind of learn that lessons. I'll leave you with two final slides, if I could move on to next slide. So Goldsmith Street has won many awards, which is why I'm invited to speak at things like this. Very keen to spread the message, and the awards are lovely, but if I can move to the next slide. This is why we do it. So that top quote that I had from walking around and speaking to a resident, where she'd moved in the November, had the 5 months over the height of the winter, but hadn't had to turn her heating on once, told me that actually that performance gap isn't there, and this is exactly what we should be building for our residents. So thank you very much. Very, very quick tour of Goldsmith Street. And I'll now hand on to Amir Paul to talk to you about the Future Home Standard.
Thank you, Andrew. So I'm Amir Paul. I work in the technical team at Homes England, and so we've heard sort of two different local authority approaches there, and you can just see that there's several ways to achieve the same thing when it comes to low and zero carbon. Next slide, please. Appreciate you've endured a lot of information this morning, so I'm going to keep it fairly brief. It's a wide topic, so I'm going to talk just about the Future Home Standard and the regulation, associated regulation. But as Ben alluded to earlier, and right at the very beginning, I mean, that sits within a wider context of other policy as well, and we've heard kind of things around biodiversity, industrial strategy, and in particular things like design codes and the planning systems. There's lots of issues around urban design as well to do with this. Next slide, please. So in summary, then I'm going to give you a little bit of intelligence we've had on the Future Home Standard. Basically, it's a piece of regulation, as hopefully many of you know, which is managed by our parent department, Department for Levelling Up Homes and Communities. And the premise is that all homes will be zero carbon ready by 2025, so that there's no further retrofit work. So it goes back to really that slide that Jim put up, really about decarbonising of the electricity grid. So as we expect that to continue to decarbonise, homes are expected to produce about 75 to 80% lower carbon emissions, and the rest is tied up in grid decarbonisation. Can you go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So in our sort of feedback, we think that heat pumps and heat networks, which Jim's already talked about, and to a lesser extent, perhaps some direct electric heating will be principal means of producing low carbon heat when gas boilers become obsolete. The government does see heat networks as an important part of its low carbon heat plans, particularly in cities and high density areas. And they're kind of looking at zoning and mapping and things like that in planning terms as well. And it's one of the reasons why we know Jim, because we work a lot with BEIS. Industry is getting to grips with kind of what that might mean, and that includes industry, I include yourselves and ourselves in that. So we're kind of all looking at and trying to work out what this means for us. We are looking at pilot sites, and we're looking to work in partnership with others to produce research and disseminate some market intelligence on this. And a big component of that will be post-occupancy evaluation. And I know that Andrew mentioned it at the end of his talk, but also it's coming up in the chat too. So could you put next slide, please? So in terms of the roadmap, the building regs, the initial feedback we're getting from developer intelligence is that the kind of initial interim arrangement doesn't pose a huge concern for developers, and these have just come into effect this summer. There's fairly well understood enhancements to fabric, and then on-plot measures such as photovoltaics, which is often abbreviated to PV, and heat recovery. So that's within the building, and that's just where you got waste heat going past on a pipe, and it's recovered in that way. Consideration of communal heat pumps, heat solutions using heat pumps and communal infrastructure is looking like a viable option for some developers, and there are kind of turnkey companies sort of emerging sort of to provide that kind of thing, energy efficient energy ESCOs and so on, energy service companies. So the transition is likely to include the fabric energy efficiency standard. So that's a kind of a fabric first approach, and we've heard from Andrew, obviously passive house is one method of achieving that. Homes England is technology agnostic in its approach, so we as long as you achieve the standards of the regulations and compliance, then we're happy in whichever method, and we're interested obviously in different approaches. But the fabric efficiency can include cavity wall increases, and on some of our sites, obviously that is raising some concerns about land take. So if you've got 2,000 units, say, on a site, obviously, and all of them are 50 millimeters wider than previous, then you may lose some units as part of that, and it affects viability. So this is what we're trying to understand. The likely benefits, though, of this interim arrangement is that we can test some lower operating temperatures of heating systems and explore new approaches to delivering heat, so underfloor heating, for instance. Next slide, please. So in terms of our feedback, we got primarily, we think initially the developers are going to look at on-plot solutions, and these likely to be individual air source heat pumps with renewables, so photovoltaic cells, for instance. And there is an urban design issue, say, about providing it at household level as well, covering individual units and machines. So it's something we're considering as part of an urban design approach. Electricity and hydrogen boilers, as far as we're aware, still in its infancy. It's a fairly limited market. Major developers seem to be storing up air source heat pump supply chains, and kind of the suppliers we're talking to are gearing up for UK production and all the rest of it to meet the regulation. The market does need policy support, though, and we work quite closely with BEIS, Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, on this whole aspect around skills and supply chain. So we were getting some current quoted costs of about £10,000 per plot uplift, with for the full future home solution next year about £15,000 to £20,000 extra per unit, and this obviously varies based on geography and approach. But these are sort of initial figures. As with all economics, this tends to tail off quite quickly as the supply chain matures. We found that with photovoltaic cells, for example. There's some additional considerations around the demand side for us. Obviously, we put infrastructure into sites, so that might be substations and power connections, and there's those connection costs may be higher or larger where there's larger electrification. And developers in those cases are considering whether battery controls and smart controls and battery storage can help alleviate some of the peak loads. So next slide, please. Okay, so we've got here communal solutions I've talked about before, and that was Jim's case study really illustrates that very well. But the ones we're looking at potentially now going forward are not gas CHP, combined heat and power, but heat pumps with co-located electric boilers. Again, there's benefits there of being able to access this plant and equipment when people are at work and so on in a better way than if it's co-located and if it's on the individual properties. I've talked about, I think, about the ESCOs, energy service companies offering these turnkey solutions. So developers like that, it de-risks the sites for them. There's no additional measures they need to put on the plot. It's just a fixed cost. And the ESCO takes on the ongoing management and maintenance. It can be lower in costs due to avoided costs. So we're doing a lot of assessments at the moment on energy strategies on counterfactual. So what would a gas connection or electric connection cost, and then what if you do it differently? What are the savings? Because often they're not compared side by side. I've mentioned the economies of scale, basically costs dropping as the technology changes. We've got a lot of pipeline sites within Homes England and with local authority partners in particular, which are transition sites which ride over the kind of regulatory change, and that's a big challenge for us. Isn't, you know, do we put gas in on phase 1, not on phase 2, phase 3, etc.? And was it cheaper to do perhaps a different and electrical only solution for the whole thing now? And that's what we're looking at as part of these pilots. Multiple phases, again, that is causing, you know, issues and problems, and we're all, I think, working on solutions for that as quickly as we can and getting the best data we can. So kind of in terms of communal solutions, as I say, these turnkey companies are basically now offering this service, which I think, you know, is quite helpful for developers, and we may see that sort of that market maturing also. Next slide, please. So in terms of the roadmap, this is kind of a summary really of kind of a previous slide where basically we've broken down what those additional costs were, the sort of 15 to 20 grand additional costs, and you know, it's primarily the on an individual basis. It's the air source heat pump with fees, which is the fabric efficiency. So you'd be looking at a technology like the one Andrew talked about, passive house, to get air tightness in there and leaking of heat sorted out. And then there's the communal solutions, you know, could be combined heat and power with heat network interface units, and photovoltaic cells. So kind of there's different approaches, and these are things that need to be done. We found very much on a site-by-site basis, but we are trying to work out if there are emerging standardized solutions coming out of development. Next slide, please. So, in terms of some of the additional considerations, heat regulation. I think there's something going through Parliament at the moment around the bill related to the heat regulation. The Heat Trust. They're looking to basically firm up a bit more kind of kind of consumer protections around that. And I think that's probably the right thing to do, because you know, previously it's been unregulated, and even the industry itself, I think, is calling largely for a bit more of a regulated space, and that will help handover of these type of projects, I think, to management companies and the consumer to have you know, assurances and protections, which will help. I think there's been some mention in the chat about electrical vehicle charging. We work with Department of Transport, obviously, on some of these issues. There's additional capital costs, obviously, for putting in a charging point, but not only that, obviously, for us putting the infrastructure in, it does cause additional demand side loads, and that's something that we have to consider in light of a wider energy strategy, not only for heating the home, but also for electrification of transport. So there's these pilot projects that we're about to kind of move on. I can't expand a lot on those today, because a lot of them we are just about going into contract with developers on. So, you know, they're not public information yet, because there's a lot of detail just to be worked through. But the aim is to you know, look at a series of sites and trial sort of Future Homes standard notional development in advance of the regulation coming in, and we'll share that with yourselves and with other partners. And so the next slide, please. The pilot schemes will inform basically that process. This is from the Future Homes Hub, who we work closely together with, the Home Builders Federation, and this is just showing sort of, you know, some of the changes needed for a typical net zero house, which is what we've talked about already, and Jim and Andrew have also expanded on some of this, which is fabric efficiency, low carbon heat, energy infrastructure, new technologies such as site-wide approaches, levelling of electrical demand, and renewable energy. The next slide, please. And so, you know, I kind of close off really with just bringing it back to my original point, that this sits, obviously it's very technical, but it sits within a wider context of a series of other policies, like the other standards that we're kind of pursuing. And Ben has talked about those in terms of what we're looking to input into our strategic plan. Things like building for a healthy life, building with nature, all these things overlap. They don't stand alone. And final slide, please. And in a similar way to Andrew's presentation, really, I think, you know, we can get lost in the technology, but in reality, you know, what we're trying to do here, and this is what we're trying to create, isn't it, collectively, all of us, is better places, sustainable places that work on a day-to-day level, as well as efficiently and carbon neutral in a carbon neutral way. Thank you very much. So I'm going to pass on to Sarah now, who's going to make some closing points.
Brilliant, thank you, Amir. Hi everybody. I can only say, wow, what an informative and inspirational session that was. I've seen the word inspirational move up and down in the chat bar a few times. So I'd like to say thank you. Please do feel free to thank our speakers. I can see quite a few people clapping there. So thank you very much. What a time to be having a session like this. I was thinking as I was watching the news this morning, crikey, we're about to hit a weekend where we're potentially going to have record-breaking temperatures. And it's amazing to think that things are already happening out there to help us mitigate some of these effects and also adapt to them as well. And I think we've heard a lot today about some of the really good work that's going on at a local level. So Jim and Andrew have told us about some of the really innovative things that they're doing to support the communities that they're working with, to help address fuel poverty issues, health and well-being issues. We talk a lot about environmental sustainability, but as Ben said earlier on, we need to recognise that sustainability is a much more rounded issue. It involves not just the environment, but social aspects, governance and economic aspects. It's an integrated approach. And certainly through my role, looking after sustainability and design, we recognise that through sustainability, you also have to have good design as well. And you have to meet the need of local residents and communities. And I think everything that we've heard today just kind of epitomises that for me. It's people are doing some really fantastic things out there. And Mia concluded on the fact that I think for me, the takeaway was partnership working is absolutely key. I saw a lot of comments in the chat bar about are developers equipped to do these kind of exemplar schemes, that we need to become business as usual? Have we got the supply chains in place? And I think that's where we're at now, isn't it? We've got some really good examples we need to make in the mainstream. I know we as an organisation are working with supply chains to look at how we can ensure that we can move some of these exemplars into business as usual. So I just wanted to say a massive, massive thank you. We've heard a lot today. I think for us, we're really, really keen to learn. We take as much from these sessions as attendees do. And I'm really keen as we move into question and answers to really get some feedback from you on what we can do to learn more, how we can learn from yourselves, where are the good things that are happening out there over and above what we've already heard today. We had a few word clouds about what some of the barriers were to delivery. I'd be really keen to hear more of those, so please do continue the chat. And really understanding how the Centre of Excellence can help you on your journey through sustainability as we go forward. And I'm really conscious that we wanted to get into question and answers, so I'm not going to say too much more. But again, thank you so much to all the speakers today, and I'm going to hand over to Laura now to conclude with some questions and answers.
Thank you, Sarah. And yeah, thank you to all of today's presenters for delivering a really great presentation. It was really interesting and I've certainly learned a lot from it. We've had a lot of questions in the chat and some of them have been answered throughout the presentation, but we've got plenty of discussion going on, which has been great to see. We'll now spend some time answering some of the most popular questions. So can I ask all the presenters just to switch the cameras back on, please? And we'll start off with Ben. We've got some questions about Homes England's approach. So the first one was about our approach to embedded carbon, whether it's going to be addressed by the government and its agencies.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, so I think embedded carbon and the kind of overall, as I said, cradle to grave kind of whole life carbon considerations are kind of rapidly rising up the agenda. I think it's something that the sector and the industry as a whole is beginning to kind of grapple with in a more concerted way. In terms of Homes England's role, we're kind of actively involved in cross-government work on this. So we're working with the Infrastructure Projects Authority, are kind of leading some work across government to kind of help settle on kind of defined standards for whole life carbon across government. And we're also working with the house building sector and three things like the Future Homes Hub, to ensure that we've got a kind of consistent approach to how we measure whole life carbon standards, which is the kind of, I think, the first step really. And that I think ensuring that we have that and ensuring that we've got kind of consistent tools that are in place then gives that sort of confidence to home builders that that we can measure embodied carbon in a kind of more consistent way, and then that creates that kind of baseline and that kind of impetus to kind of go further and start to perhaps kind of set standards around that and pursue those. So it's I think we're as an industry relatively kind of early in the journey there when we look at the kind of mainstream of the industry, but it's something that we're kind of involved in kind of pushing forward with across government and with others in the sector.
Great, thanks Ben, that was great. And I've got another question for you, Ben, again linked to Homes England's strategy. So would it be fair to say that part of Homes England's remit is to help to deliver exemplar schemes reflecting government policy, or is it more pragmatic than that?
So I think the answer to that is it's both. So we grapple with this a lot. I think as an agency, we have that role in helping to kind of develop and share best practice and to support the industry and to support our partners to deliver on their sustainability aspirations. I think we Emir pointed to kind of some of the work that we're doing on kind of on the sort of research side, to kind of look at kind of specific technologies and what might be kind of effective in delivering Future Home Standard, for example. And we're committed to kind of sharing those examples and helping to kind of I guess drive forward the sort of cutting edge of the industry in that in those sorts of areas. I think we also have to acknowledge that Homes England has a range of policy objectives that it needs to consistently balance, and we have to engage with and operate within the market on a kind of commercial basis, and so. So yeah, I guess in answer to the question, we have to blend those two things, and we might be doing those two things at different times in different places, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Ben. That was really clear. Thank you. And Sarah, I don't know if just from like having someone else from Homes England on the side of this, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add on that or touch on, or.
I think Ben's kind of said it all there, really. I think we as an organisation, it's what I said earlier on, I think we as an organisation are really keen to learn. We do work very closely with government. We do help influence policy and provide technical expertise. But part of what we need to do as well is look out to the market and the sector and say what's already happening. Andrew and James have presented some really great ideas, concepts, innovation that's already happening, and we should be building on that and learning on that. And we are a learning organisation, so we are going to be coming out and looking at what benchmarks exist, what's already happening, what can we do to support the sector even more. Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. So we've got quite a lot of questions on the case study specific. So I'll come to Jim first. And I think some of these have, Jim, you started to sort of answer these in the chat, but if there's anything you want to sort of elaborate on. But one of the questions we've got is, how long will the mines maintain a 15-degree temperature if you're cooling it?
Yeah, and the simple answer is we don't know yet. The Coal Authority are learning how many of these schemes they can permit in a certain area. But the important thing is we always take out the water from a different mine working that we put it back in. So basically, it will find its way back and mix eventually. But because we put it in a different level, it should have time to recharge and reheat on its way. But we'll find out as we start monitoring using it over the next couple of years.
Thanks, Jim. That's helpful. And then another one for you is, how are you managing and calculating the abnormally high gas prices and making it affordable?
Yeah, it's been a massive challenge. I mean, we managed through last winter effectively, because we're a heat network that generates power and sells it to our customers and also sells it to the grid. So even though we had an extra £1 million of gas costs last year, we raised an extra £1 million in income by selling power to the grid as well. And so we were managed to defer any price rises for our customers largely till sort of like this April. This year it's even more challenging. We've gone to doing monthly tariffs for our customers, but again, we basically play the markets. While there's a lot of price in the market in the future, we're seeing some of that risk on the day ahead and month ahead coming off, and so we're buying slightly cheaper gas, sort of day to day and month to month. And we've been able to deliver lower than expected tariffs to our customers. Basically, we're on a kind of pass-through arrangement, but the assurance they get is whatever they end up paying, it will be better than what they've been paying on the market, and so they still get that benchmark below the market rate.
Perfect, thank you. That was a really great answer as well. Andrew, I've got a question for you on your scheme. Well, it's a bit more of a broader question, I'd say, actually, this one, but how achievable is it to retrofit passive house standards in existing homes?
Yeah, it's something that we haven't done, but it's something that I'm kind of keen to have a look at. I know there's a number of schemes out there, such as Enefit, that you can kind of look at for this. I think the costs of retrofitting to passive house are quite high from what I've seen so far. And I think until there's some real momentum to look at our existing stock as a country and to think about how we can get economies of scale and start to drive down the costs, it's going to be a difficult one for us to go to fully passive house, is what I would suggest. I think someone's just put in the chat as well that Nottingham have done Energy Sprong, and that's one of the systems that I have seen. But again, that's one of the ones that I saw quite high costs on.
No, again, that's really helpful. Sorry, I did get stuck on mute then, so I wasn't ignoring you on purpose.
It's fine.
Thank you, Andrew. That was great. And another one for you, and one for Jim as well, like a bit of like a, we'll do this one in two parts, but we've had another question, like a number of questions about changing perceptions. So for Andrew, have you seen any changes in perceptions to deliver more passive house schemes from private developers since this scheme's been built? And then Jim, if you want to kind of add on to this at the end, there's another one. Do you have any advice on bringing the community and members along with you?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And obviously, since Goldsmith Street got quite a lot of high profile, there's been more interest in passive house, and there's been more local authorities that are certainly embracing it. And as I said in my presentation, there are some local registered providers that have delivered it as well. We haven't seen a take up in the private sector necessarily for passive house, and our own experience of delivering private homes showed an initial premium that we were achieving of around 5% on the sales values. But I think house buying is an interesting subject, and I think until estate agents and until RICs start to understand that energy will become something that consumers start to demand from their homes, they're not seeing that uplift in the values. But I think it's something that will come, and it will start to feed into developers kind of looking at passive house and other systems that will achieve those higher standards, particularly around fabric first and kind of those more passive elements that it's not a lot of kit to add on.
Because there's questions about retrofits, it's probably just worth clarifying our position on retrofit in Homes England, in that we used to have a role. Obviously, predecessor organisations were involved in things like Decent Homes Standard, and we do know partners like Energy Sprong that have been mentioned in the chat. And we understand the agenda as it applies to new build, but currently we are deregulated in that space, and we obviously keep a close eye on it, but our focus is primarily around new build development.
Thank you. And Jim, I don't know if you had anything to add on, like any advice on bringing the community and members along with you.
I think the main thing we've learned is to target it to where it's appropriate. So, for example, when you're building the infrastructure, you only need, we found engagement was only useful for those that are directly impacted by the energy centre or the network you're building. I think the customers on the network were far more engaged in just what did it mean for them, what box were they going to have in their house, how are they going to use it, and that's where we focused our engagement for particularly the retrofit residents, where we were taking a heat connection into their homes. And to be fair, that was greater when we were doing a heating upgrade as well, for example, changing from electric heaters to wet heaters. But we found the response to that has always been incredibly positive. And people do like the transition. We've seen some useful examples as well in the hydrogen work that Northern Gas Network has done. Their best guide of success is that some of their customers, forgot they were a part of a hydrogen trial, because effectively they've just changed the gas source and everything stays normal. And almost what we've seen is that the less you change for the end user, the more acceptable it is. And this is where some of the biggest challenges we've had is when we put air source heat pumps into social housing, and the amount of support and engagement in particularly vulnerable communities to learn how to use them differently has been really challenging for us. And that's why we try and sort of like, almost keep it as simple and as similar to what they've got already.
Thanks, Jim. That was really great. Thank you. We've got time, I think, for like one more question, and I'm going to make it a bit like open between you, Jim, and Andrew. But there's been a lot of questions about sort of cost and financial viability. So there was one specifically on the Norwich scheme about whether you received funding to make the scheme, or was the scheme already kind of viable? And I guess, Jim, like again, if there's any sort of like comments you want to make on cost with your particular scheme.
I think, yeah, for me, we're very lucky that we've got 14,500 properties that we can borrow against in our housing revenue account, and we can kind of look at it as a holistic housing revenue account rather than necessarily looking scheme by scheme. But we do that, and the payback periods are perhaps a little bit longer than what a private developer would look at. So, we're looking at kind of 40 to 50 year payback periods at the moment. Typically, though, that's because we use social rents rather than affordable rents, so we're kind of got a lower rent base. We did have right to buy receipts that went into this, which precluded us from talking to Homes England about some grant funding. But we are certainly open to all and every funding opportunity we can get. There's some new funding been announced by One Public Estate in Brownfield Land Release Fund, for example. So we would look at those kind of opportunities to see where we can.
And I guess in terms of the schemes that we deliver, I guess our threshold is they have to be commercially viable. And so that's where we'll put together a scheme that uses our own investment, grant investment, and also the revenues we make. And effectively, the geography of the scheme dictates how big or how far it can go. And what we're trying to do now is really push the boundaries to see if we can get costs down in some of the sort of like the lower rise connections to start bringing those into schemes. But I guess it was challenging before this year. I think particularly with the construction market, massive increases we've seen, we're taking a bit of a pause at the moment to hopefully see that inflation, settle down and come off a bit before we start and embark on the next one.
Thanks, Jim and Andrew. That was really great. Yeah, that was really helpful. I understood that. Sarah, I just wondered if there's anything you wanted to add on the cost side from Homes England's.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I think cost is understandably the key issue that people speak about, and there's been lots of comments in the chat, and was it the number one barrier to delivery? So I do think that we've seen, I mean, when you look at the schemes around PV at the moment, about photovoltaics at the moment, some of the costs there are starting to decrease significantly. So we will get to a point where a lot of these technologies become really viable. I think the bit of the equation that we may be missing out on as a whole across the country is the value, though, that these things can bring. And I know we've talked about the social value aspect of it, but if we are able to find a way to approach these solutions on a whole life cost basis, from concept right through to the end user occupancy, I'm sure we'll be able to make the business cases stack up much more. And there's also something around the value generated as well, with the value of placemaking, high quality places that people want to live in as well. And I do think it's worth the industry looking at how we can actually bring these sorts of values into the original equation when we're making the business cases. I just maybe think we haven't got enough evidence yet to demonstrate that.
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. Well, we're running out of time now for Q&A, so I will kind of move us on to the next thing. But thanks so much for all the great questions in the chat. And thank you to all our presenters for answering those. Anything that we didn't kind of get to, we'll try and get back to you over email and respond in the future and stuff. So yeah, sorry if we didn't get a chance to answer your question today verbally, but we will try and answer it. I'd just like to say thank you once again to all of our presenters today, Andrew, Ben, Amir, Jim and Sarah, for a fantastic presentation. I'd like to also thank the Local Government Capacity Centre for their hard work behind the scenes to organise and facilitate this session. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to thank the audience for taking your time to join the session today and engage in the chat and ask plenty of thought-provoking and insightful questions, and also touch on some of your own experiences, which has been really interesting to read about. So if you do have any questions, please do get in touch with the Local Government Capacity Centre via the contact details shown on the slide. And the best sort of option is probably to email using the cce@homesengland.gov.uk email, and someone will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you everyone for joining today. Have a great afternoon and goodbye.